Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker, and today I'm going to be doing the final solo show, the final fulfillment of my promise for on the Shroud of Turin, continuing on my series. So this is going to be on the last ordinary artistic mechanism. I wanted to finish that off before I start up the school semester in the fall, and I'm going to have to take a break from doing my solo shows for a couple months or so until I have time to resume, but definitely I will get back into picking up where I left off with this Shroud series, as well as some of my other solo series once I start getting the time during the fall semester or perhaps in December at the latest. That said, just because I'm taking a break on the Shroud solo series, that doesn't mean necessarily that I'm going to be taking a break on the Shroud of Turin altogether, because I do have planned at least one or two Shroud Wars debates with Hugh Ferry. So again, I want to bring him on and try to bring on a carbon-14 scientist and discuss the carbon-14 dating. On that one, I'll be, and also I reached out to my friend Dr. Gary Habermas, and I'm hoping that he'll be willing to come on to discuss again the historicity, but this time specifically looking at the evidences for and against its link to Jesus directly. If I can get him on, or perhaps if he's too busy, obviously he's got a lot going on and that sort of thing. He's a very popular and in-demand scholar. So if that doesn't work out, then I'll try to find another biblical scholar who might be able to come on and address some of those types of issues. So so Shroud solo shows might be on a little bit of a hiatus just while I work out my fall schedule for a bit. They will be back. I promise I'm going to finish this December at the latest, either December or before. But in the meantime, I will have at least one or two Shroud debates or discussion shows in the works that I'm hoping to be able to do with you guys. So, but yeah, I wanted to make sure that I got this done before I started up the semester in the fall and finish off the last of the ordinary artistic mechanisms. And that's going to be the heat-based image-forming mechanisms as a possible explanation for the images on the Shroud of Turin. So this is an ordinary artistic method. People kind of speculated that they used heating or some kind of scorch, a light scorch, to create these Shroud's body images. And one last sort of a clarification note or announcement before we start getting straight into that heat-based or scorch types hypotheses. So as in this category, this is an umbrella category. There are multiple proponents and have slightly different methods and that sort of thing. One of those proponents is Dr. Colin Berry, a infamous Shroud skeptic who's been on the internet. I've engaged with him a bit on back in the SNS days and that sort of thing. And we've sort of conversed. So his method is something that's constantly evolving. He's updating his technique, his experiments, and that sort of thing. And he's finally just finished. As of December 2020, that was his final update note on his blog. I'm going to be including links to that and that sort of thing in the blog for you guys to check on. But he's finally finished. He's given his final report and he's arrived at his final method. I think he calls it the film set method or something like that. So it's important to note, due to time constraints, I didn't have time to update and address his actual method as it is in 2020. I'm refuting a much older version of his hypothesis, or the toastograph hypothesis, as we'll find out. So the criticisms that I'm going to be making in this show are going to be outdated compared to his newer results, to some extent at least. And because of that, because I didn't have time to do an update, what I plan to do when I get to it at some point, after I finish all of the ordinary mechanisms and assessing the various mechanisms that I have from my 300-page Shroud chapter, which I made back in 2017, 2016, 2018, in and around there. After I'm done that, I'm going to do another last show addressing updated models. So on that, I'm going to address Hugh Ferry's model and give an assessment of that, because that's something that we didn't cover when I did other powder rubbing or stuff like that. I'm going to address Colin Berry's final method and do an evaluation of that. And there's also an update that I will incorporate naturally into the show when I come to it, because we haven't done it yet. When we come to Dan Spicer and E.T. Totten's low energy electrostatic method, or electric charge separation technique, as an ordinary naturalistic type mechanism that they proposed back in 2014, I believe it was. But yeah, so there is an update. When I evaluated that in my 300-page chapter in the Shroud of Turin, I wasn't able to find any sort of valid criticisms against it in the Shroud literature. And it seemed to me that it did fulfill the body images, at least. It struggled with the blood stain images, I thought, but it seemed like it could account as a natural mechanism for all of the body images. And on that basis, the mechanistic argument was a failure for me, at least with respect to the body images at that time. Now, since then, I've been lucky enough to engage with Shroud scholars, Barry Schwartz, Hugh Ferry, Mark Antinacci was on my show, and Joe Marino and Bob Rucker and all these great guys. So I've obviously going to need to update because now I think it fails mechanistically. There are multiple criticisms of it, and so I'm gonna incorporate that update into that show when I get to it. Whenever I post that up and we cover those image forming mechanisms. So yeah, those are the three main massive updates in terms of image forming mechanism assessment that I want to do. The two ordinary artistic ones in terms of Colin Berry and Hugh Ferry's method, I'm going to do an independent show on those updates. With Dan Spicer, I'm going to incorporate the updates into the show when I get to covering those mechanisms. So yeah, with that said, that's it in terms of the announcements. Let's get straight into the heat-based and/or scorch techniques and see how they do. Okay, so this is an umbrella category again. So there's, as I said, multiple proponents, multiple methods. Even certain proponents had multiple different types of methods as they modified their approach. As we found out with Colin Berry, he did scientific experiments from 2012 to 2020, and he updated his approach and that sort of thing. But in the first place, this method was really first seriously considered in 1961. This was the first known attempt to try and duplicate the Shroud images using some kind of scorch technique. And what they did, so they had a white handkerchief was placed on top of a small metal medallion with a horse carving on it. And then it was subsequently heated to encode the images on the cloth. Now, there were massive problems with this. It was an utter failure. It was no duplication for the Shroud and that sort of thing. But nonetheless, the concept was established that maybe some kind of scorching or heat was used to encode the images on the Shroud. And because of this, credible STURP scientists in 1978 and that sort of thing, when they were studying the Shroud, took seriously this image-forming mechanism and designed scientific experiments to rigorously test and ultimately falsify these types of methods. So Doctors Jackson, Jumper, and Erkeline thoroughly tested all of these types of hypotheses with an extensive battery of various scientific experiments and testing, all of which revealed multiple types of problems with these techniques. Okay, great. Before we get into that, let's learn a little bit about some of these. So as I said, there are multiple types of techniques here, but the three best examples of the heat scorch techniques that I want to cover in this show are, number one, the hot scorch bas-relief hypothesis. So this was tested and made up by Pesce Delfino in and around the year 2001. And Delfino is infamous as a monumental Italian Shroud skeptic. And essentially in 2001, various STURP scientists kind of describe his experimental results, which are the best of this type of method. As I said, there have been attempts since the early 1960s, since 1961, to do something along these lines. But by far, Pesce Delfino, in 2001, he gave the best results using this experimental technique, using the scorch or hot bas-relief technique. And STURP scientists have described his method as follows, quote unquote, Delfino used a metal sculpture or bas-relief of a human face, heated it to approximately 200 degrees Celsius, otherwise for you Americans, 392 degrees Fahrenheit, and then impressed a piece of linen cloth onto the sculpture in order to leave a scorched image. Delfino limited his effort to creating a facial image only. He also did not even attempt to include any blood stains or details of blood exudates from the wounds. So that's how these credible STURP scientists mention his method and describe it there. Okay, then there's the hot statue method, a three-dimensional statue method. Same principle. So this was by people like Colin Berry, for example. That again, this is the outdated version of his theory that I was researching at the time I wrote this. He's since updated it, but there's similar stuff here. So it's the same principle, a hot statue, but this technique basically works the same way as the heated bas-relief method that we're addressing in this show, except that the technique involves a full three-dimensional statue covered in a linen cloth and then it being heated instead of a bas-relief. So yeah, Colin Berry, he's done his own scientific experiments. He's got a blog detailing all of his results with pictures and that sort of thing. He's probably the most recent proponent. He's been working on this from 2012 all the way up to 2020 when he finally stopped. But yeah, he calls his theory, or at least back in around 2016 to 2018, he was calling his theory the thermal impression method, or the toastograph hypothesis, where he kind of uses the comical analogy of toasted bread to try to explain how he thinks the Shroud's body images were formed. And essentially his technique involves using a statue covered in flour to leave an imprint on a wet linen cloth. And when I say his technique, again, this is at least his technique back then, and it's essentially the same in 2020, but again, I haven't researched the update, so I don't want to speak to that. But at least at this time, essentially his technique involved the statue being covered in flour, leaving an imprint on a wet linen cloth, and then heating that cloth at a relatively low temperature in order to produce lightly scorched body images on the shroud. And to do the heating, basically Colin uses a radiating heat source, so he attempts using a convection heat oven, so that's kind of comparable to a medieval charcoal fire technique. And essentially both methods get the same results, according to Colin Berry. And in his first article, so Colin Berry confidently makes confident announcements in his blog. You'll see things like, quote-unquote, thermal imprinting with white flour on linen can account for the curious properties of the Turin Shroud body image. And later on in the same article, he actually gives a checklist of all the features, physical and chemical characteristics of the Shroud of Turin that he claims to have duplicated using this toastograph technique. So he says, look, quote unquote, the ticked off boxes were as follows. 1. Yellow to brown coloring, photographic negative, or tone reversed image. So that's the photo negativity he's claiming, as well as that yellow to brown color. Number 2, it's a fuzzy image, so that's the image diffuseness. There's no defined outline. 3, positive response of body image to 3D rendering software, so the tridimensionality has been reproduced. He also gets number 4, heat and water resistance or longevity. Remember, the Shroud of Turin is remarkably preserved for its age. Even if it's medieval, it's remarkably preserved. Number 5, he claims to have reproduced a superficial image, with a qualification, inasmuch as color is concentrated on crown, loop over threads, though not exclusive to those locations. So that's a little bit telling. Again, this is an older blog. Let's see what he says in his updated things, but at least at this time, he has that qualification, interesting, on the superficial image. Number 6, he's reproduced bleachability through domestic bleach. So that's indicative of carbon-based chemical structures, or what he says, matching diamide bleachability reported by Heller and Adler for the Shroud of Turin. Number 7, curious microscopic properties, namely the so-called quote-unquote half-tone effect and abrupt imaging discontinuities on a single fibers. And then he updates, I have now successfully ticked the crucial final box, arguably the trickiest of all, namely to account for the so-called second face, aka the reverse side faint visible image. So that's that double superficiality aspect of the face that some Shroud experts like Giulio Fonte said they found there's not just one superficial image of the face, but on the back of the cloth there's a second superficial image of the face there. So that's double superficiality. Now that's not well established enough to be considered a minimal relevant feature. So Colin Berry doesn't have to account for this, but he's gone above and beyond, so to speak, and claims, well, I can even get this. If it's true that the Shroud has double superficiality, my technique will give that to you, according to him. That's impressive. That's the claims. That is what Colin Berry's technique was, and it's essentially the same now. As of 2020, when he stopped doing his experiments. But again, I haven't researched his new method, so I don't know what tweaks would be there and that sort of thing. I need to research that in a future show. But yeah, again, focused on Colin Berry as of 2016, 2018 to 2018, in and around there. So great. So that's Colin Berry's technique and what it entails. And then finally, the third type of technique here, heat-based technique we're looking at, is the quote-unquote engraved lines technique. So this method wasn't dreamt up, believe it or not, wasn't dreamt up by an evil Shroud skeptic, a bad guy or something like that. It was actually two credible STIRP scientists on the pro-Shroud side, Larry A. Schwalbe and Dr. Raymond Rogers, the friend of Barry Schwartz, who's that expert chemist who's always got mentioned. He's written multiple peer-reviewed papers on the Shroud evidence. These guys are pro-Shroud experts, but at one time they actually speculated maybe the Shroud's body images could have been created without the need to postulate a 3D statue or object or any kind of action at a distance heating mechanism, which is different from the first two heating techniques that we use. The bas-relief and or the 3D statue inherently have three-dimensional, at least some three-dimensional information in them that can be encoded onto the cloth. In this method, they're saying, well, maybe we don't even need that. Let's do an experiment to see if that worked with engraved lines. So they wondered, would it be possible to encode the images onto cloth by simply suspending a flat metal sheet, one that had been previously engraved with the Shroud's 3D body images on them, and then heating that sheet while covered by the cloth. So theoretically, the engraved lines would change the emission of heat at various points throughout the metal plate, and then the radiant heat would then discolor or lightly scorch the fibrils to produce the image accordingly. Theoretically, this was the plan anyways, that they had in mind. Now, this research was then further supplemented by the STIRP scientist, again a pro-Shroud expert, Dr. John Jackson, who also conducted scientific experiments using a copper metal sheet to study the resultant radiant emissions and images that would be produced using this type of method. Oh, and I forgot to mention, so these scientific experiments, or this method, was proposed back in the early 1980s. So 1982, around that time, just after the STIRP scientific experiments were finished and the final report came out, that's when they were doing this engraved lines technique and doing the experiments to see what the results would be using this method. So that's our three types of methods that we're going to be covering here. Let's get it straight into the assessment and an evaluation here. How do these techniques do in terms of reproducing the Shroud's physical and chemical minimal relevant? Okay, so in terms of minimal relevant feature number one, that's the photographic negativity or quasi-negativity, image diffuseness, and then the high resolution features of the Shroud of Turin's images, body images there. So in terms of these techniques, in general, these hypotheses do seem to account for the photographic negativity aspect of the Shroud's body images. However, there are differing outcomes when it comes to the issue of the Shroud's high resolution. The hot bas-relief method proposed by Pesce Delfino, for example, he does seem to be able to produce consistently high resolution results with the Shroud images. Even the credible pro-Shroud experts and scientists admit, quote unquote, a bas-relief method can achieve high resolution because the bas-relief cloth to body distance is by definition small as compared to the features to be resolved. Now, it's important to note here that pro-Shroud expert Mark Antonici, he differs with this, and he provides pictures of hot scorch bas-relief techniques. And he says, look, Antonici says, quote unquote, the resulting image from a heated bas-relief method lacks the high resolution and sharp focus found on the Shroud. So there is a bit of controversy here. I'm kind of, again, I assume in favor of the Shroud skeptic whenever there's any doubt and that sort of thing. So it seems like at least some pro-Shroud experts are saying the hot bas-relief can do the high resolution images, so we give that a green check mark there. But just note that not everyone agrees about that. Okay, what about the hot statue method, Dr. Colin Berry's techniques and those like it? So, in general, hot statue methods inevitably involve isotropic radiation or heat sources. So, those radiate in all directions equally, and as such, in addition to breaching minimal relevant feature number 4, the vertical mapping that we'll get into when we get to that, it also produces blurry, low-resolution images. And this is confirmed by various photos, even photos provided by Colin Berry himself on his own websites. They seem to lack the same level of sharp focus that the Shroud images have, comparatively speaking. But just to be fair here, the Shroud skeptic Colin Berry has at least produced somewhat reasonably definable images. As I said, they lack the same quality of clarity and sharp focus that the Shroud images have. At least as of the time that I was writing this Shroud chapter and doing my assessment on his technique. That may have changed as of 2020. Again, we'll get to that in the future show. But again, from where we were when I was writing this chapter and assessing his technique at that time, his images weren't really up to the Shroud's high-resolution photos. So I assigned it a questionable status at best on this front. Okay, finally, what about the engraved lines technique? How does that perform on minimal relevant feature number 1? Well, this method does account for the photonegativity feature, but the STURP scientists discovered that there were some problems with the high resolution issue. Basically, during their own experiments using this method, they found that various quote-unquote reaction products from the heated linen were then deposited onto the metal, which in turn would result in differing image densities, and consequently only low image resolution was ever able to be obtained using the engraved lines technique. So this was an inherent problem with the method, and it's ultimately a failure. Believe it or not, STURP scientists even attempted to cheat and to test this technique using filter paper instead of linen, just to see if they could produce better results using it. But even still, the resulting facial images were almost completely unrecognizable. So this was an utter failure in terms of the high resolution feature using the engraved lines technique method. Okay, what about minimal relevant feature number 2? And this is with respect to the body image uniformity and the aspects on that front. Okay, so with the minimal feature number 2, the body image uniformity, with respect to the hot or scorched bas-relief technique mechanisms, there seems to be some confusion in the sources, in the scholarly literature. So some sources saying that these types of mechanisms can achieve the Shroud's uniform density. So the back image, the dorsal image, is the same darkness as what's on the front image. But other sources bring up various concerns in this regard. So even the pro-Shroud experts that concede that yes, the hot bas-relief methods can produce uniform density, they do at least caution and say, quote unquote, it must be noted that it would require outstanding temperature control for the frontal and dorsal image to have the same maximum image density. In this method, that would require 2 separate bas-reliefs to be heated and applied to the cloth separately. We know of no confirming experimental scientific evidence for this item, even though we judge it theoretically consistent or possible. So these pro-Shroud experts that grant it are being extremely generous in a way that's just historically implausible to be the case. I mean, 2 bas-reliefs that are exactly a match and able to produce the back and front images of the same density and that sort of thing. So they finish off, quote unquote, the Shroud would be the only example known. So that's going to be an issue when we come to implausibility. But nonetheless, some Shroud skeptics grant it. So despite our reservations on this front, I'm going to follow these pro-Shroud scientists' lead. And again, I assume in favor of the Shroud skeptic and against my argument. So we're going to grant them that they can do the uniform density. However, it is highly unlikely that this technique or any other Scorch method could even possibly account for the uniform intensity of the color. The fact that every individual fibril is colored exactly the same with the same intensity. Because, even if the heat intensity were uniform throughout both of the bas-reliefs, highly suspicious there. But even if we grant that, and that's a huge concession, because it is historically implausible or impossible even for a medieval bas-relief, two medieval bas-reliefs to be so exactly made as to allow for uniform heat to color these shroud images. Maybe they made the back one slightly denser or something like that, or there was a slight variation in how they made one bas-relief compared to the dorsal head bas-relief image or something like that, and that would mean heat wouldn't be uniformly distributed throughout it. There would be slight variations and differences. So this is a huge concession. Even the shroud scientists are saying, look, it's so problematic. Even if we grant you that by some miracle a medieval man was able to make two separate bas-reliefs that would exactly the same with respect to how they radiated heat when they encoded the images. There was no variations in the densities of them or the material, or something that would make it so that the heat would distribute through them differently and therefore encode on the cloth differently in terms of the body image uniform densities of color. Even if we grant you that, there's still a problem. It seems inevitable that variations in color would still be present on the individual fibrils based on variations in contact pressure, for example. What certain fibers have more contact pressure with this heated thing compared to relative to others. They wouldn't all have this uniform intensity of color. And this is STIRP scientist Dr. John Jackson also tested this hypothesis and stated, quote unquote, another difficulty lies in image contrast or intensity. The maximum shading of the full-size bas-relief image was much greater than the shroud, approaching a deep brown scorch. So not light brown to yellow color, it was deep brown. This high intensity of shading at contact points was necessary in order for the more distant parts of the bas-relief to record their patterns on the cloth. So in other words, you couldn't make it a lighter scorch by lifting the cloth, making it further distance from the bas-relief, because then the areas that would be even further away wouldn't get colored at all, wouldn't be scorched at all. So you had to keep it that close. So what I'm talking about here is the nose. The nose, for example, is closer to the thing than the cheekbones or something like that. So you had to keep it that minimal distance. But if you did that, well, then the nose became dark brown and scorched, which doesn't match the shroud. Well, if you lifted the nose slightly further away from the cloth, so that the nose would be encoded as a light brown, light scorch, well, then the cheeks would be too far away and they wouldn't get encoded. That's what they're talking about, just to give it an analogy or an example of what they're talking about. So, yeah, Dr. Jackson goes on. It thus appears as though linen has a thermal response such that exceedingly low bas-reliefs are necessary in order to produce an image with an overall contrast or variation that's as subtle as is seen on the shroud. So yeah, this is just not. It's scientifically falsified that these techniques can account for that aspect of the shroud's images. And not only that, there's that historical implausibility, because the construction of a bas-relief poses that's exactly equal. That's extremely impossible for human beings to produce in the medieval period. No craftsman would be able to even produce such a thing. So that's an historical implausibility right there. Now, Jackson even went further in testing a wet cloth as opposed to a dry one to see if that would help by extending the quote-unquote scorch time at all. But he just discovered that doing this only produced a worse non-uniform image. It made things worse than they were with a dry cloth. And it severely impacted upon the three-dimensional characteristics of the shroud too. So this is just an utter failure. The hot bas-reliefs, utter failure in terms of body image, uniformity, intensity of color. Okay, well, what about the hot statue method? So the hot statue method cannot explain the uniform intensity of color on the shroud. I'm going to be linking in the blog to a scholarly article, a great article by Thibaut Heimberger. He's a great pro-shroud expert and scholar. Barry Schwartz loves him, and Colin Berry likes him. I think I remember Colin Berry kind of humorously had up on his blog. He's a bit of a character. So am I. On the Pro Shroud side, I kind of use overly bombastic language at times, so that's cool. Colin's allowed to do that too on his end as a Shroud skeptic. But so he kind of listed off heroes and villains. So most of the Pro Shroud guys are on the villain side, and I think that Colin actually has Thibaut Heimberger. It's been a while since I saw it, but he's in the heroes list. So if Colin Berry is saying Thibaut Heimberger is a good scientist, someone to listen to, and Barry Schwartz on the Pro Shroud side loves Thibaut Heimberger, knows him as well. I hope at some point to ask Barry if I can get Heimberger on as well. I'm going to try to get Colin on at some point to discuss his method, if he'd be willing to do it, and that sort of thing. But the point is, Thibaut Heimberger is someone that's respected by both sides here, and he's done an assessment of the hot statue method, and he says, quote unquote, in the more colored areas, shading is not obtained by a higher density of only pale yellowed fibers, but by a higher density of more colored fibers, with a wide range of colors, from brown, dark brown, or burned fibers, to a few pale yellow fibers, all with the gradient described above. He also goes on to add that the signature of a scorch is found in all kinds of scorches, even in very light and light scorches. So even at the lowest possible temperatures, some protruding burned fibers will always be scientifically observed microscopically, and many small opaque brown to dark burned pieces of fibers are easily found everywhere in these sticky tape experiments. This was not the case from direct observations through the microscope on the Shroud of Turin's 1978 sticky tape. Now, secondly, what's even worse here is that the color tends to become light brown to brown in the most superficial parts of the colored threads. In some areas that are called quote-unquote micro hotspots, there are even burnt fibers to be found there. So these hotspots really create inevitable, well-defined regions of enhanced image density or image intensity. So this method, it's highly unlikely to create uniform intensity of body image color on both the frontal and dorsal images. So it would fail the uniform density of color as well. Now, there is one thing here that perhaps Colin Berry's hot statue method may get out, and it's both Pro Shroud proponents, Antonacci and Heimberger, who mention this issue, say that these hotspots inevitably result from the use of thermal conduction. So that isn't necessarily the same as Colin Berry's. He uses radiated or infrared heat sources in his latest experiments. So remember how I said he updates over the years. So these criticisms might have applied to his techniques at an earlier time, but not necessarily now that he's using a radiated heat source, convection oven, rather than thermal conduction. So that's an issue there. So just because at the time I made this, because there was lack of clarification on that front, I assigned this a questionable status for the hot statue method, and I will look into this in further detail when I assess his updated 2020 results. Okay, finally with the engraved lines technique. So it was observed during STURP scientists' experiments that various reaction products, remember these were deposited onto the linen, from the linen onto the metal sheet that was heating the cloth. And this resulted in differing densities in the heat emissions caught, and that caused various disruptions in the engraved lines being encoded onto the shroud cloth. So this method just inherently scientifically impossible. It cannot produce the uniform maximum densities on the shroud's body images. And interestingly, Thibaut Heimberger has done more recent scientific experiments where he sort of assesses various scorch techniques and other methods, very light scorches, light scorch, and full-on scorch images. But he pays special attention at one point to addressing the old engraved lines hypothesis from 1982. And he says this, with respect to the uniform color intensity, quote unquote, a true contact is necessary to obtain a color. Radiant energy through air simply does not work. So what this scientifically proves, according to Heimberger, is that in order to get any kind of image, there has to be contact. Again, one of our minimal relevant features, number 4, is about the non-contact zone. So there has to be some kind of contact to create this image. Radiant energy doesn't encode through air in order to burn the cloth or that sort of thing. So that's an interesting thing right there, and it shows that it would utterly fail. So, all right, let's move on to minimal relevant feature number 3. So these methods, by and large, are have a questionable status with regards to the Shroud's three-dimensional information being coded. The bas-reliefs and perhaps the hot statue method. So scientists have discovered, Thibaut Heimberger, for example, mentions that there seems to be a trade-off, scientifically speaking. So the more three-dimensional effects you get, the three-dimensional effects seem to be lacking in these techniques, so it's not a duplicate of the Shroud. But in order to get better three-dimensional data, there seems to be a trade-off that's inevitable. So you have to sacrifice on body image superficiality by pressing areas of the cloth closer to the heat source. Thereby it burns through the cloth. You don't have a superficial image, which is minimal relevant feature number 5 that we'll get to. But if you don't press it so hard and you maintain superficiality, then you sacrifice on the three-dimensional information. You get less 3D effects encoded onto the Shroud's cloth. So it seems to be a questionable status. You have to, in order to get one that's better, it's still not perfect like the Shroud of Turin, although Colin Berry's new 2020 results do seem very well. If the picture is true and we can trust the results and that sort of thing, I'll have to look into that. But in order to get the 3D, you have to sacrifice on body image superficiality. So there is this trade-off between these two minimal relevant features. You can't get both, but the Shroud of Turin has both, so therefore it's falsified. But just to give some more specifics outside of this questionable status in general, the hot statue method in particular seems to be even worse than the hot bas-relief, or in this respect, because radiated heat would flow out in all directions equally and thereby fail to produce an image that contained all the necessary 3D information. Thibaut Heimberger has admitted that such techniques produce at least some three-dimensional correlations, provided that the images are sufficiently contrasted. Unfortunately, though, Heimberger has scientifically discovered through his scientific experiments that light scorches, which are required to create the image superficiality, these do not contain sufficient contrast to allow for the corresponding three-dimensional information to be encoded in its resultant images. So this is a problem for Colin Berry's method. Berry's 2020 results, he's got pictures of 3D images up there. Whether that's reliable or not or whatever, I don't know, because I haven't looked into it. So I'm going to assign a questionable status on this front in terms of the three-dimensional information, but just understand that there is this contrast between these two competing features. You can't get both. It seems like there's a problem. If you want to get more three-dimensional information, you got to push this thing closer to the heat source, and that would sacrifice body image superficiality. If you want to get superficiality and do these light scorches, well, then you're not going to get a sufficient contrast to encode the true three-dimensional information as seen on the Shroud of Turin. So that's why we're giving it a hot statue methods a questionable status. Again, that's largely due to the fact that Colin Berry has that 2020 updated technique, and I need to look into how that performs specifically. Okay, finally, with the engraved lines technique, this is an utter failure on the three-dimensional information. It just can't do it at all because of the deposition of those reaction products that are caused on the resultant images. So it just utterly fails to have any three-dimensional correlations at all. Okay, moving on to minimal relevant feature number 4. So this is the vertically mapped wrapping distortions, the full body images, the non-contact zones, and the fact that no body side images or the tops of the head were encoded. Now, just speaking sort of generally, scorched images are only found, as we saw a scientifically proven fact, where perfect contact between the linen and the heated template is, whether that's a metal bas-relief, a statue, or an engraved plate, there has to be direct contact or no image is encoded. Heat doesn't radiate through the air to scorch the cloth. And Heimberger's experiments have proven that. So has the Shroud skeptic Colin Berry's experiments demonstrate that as well. What's funny is, so in general, all these methods fail to account for the full-length body images. They never give you a full body image. They suffer, just like Luigi Garlascelli's experimental results, where he used a body covered in paint powder on a human torso as well as a bas-relief. And what's funny, I just took a look, so the pictures of Colin Berry's, even though I haven't assessed his updated 2020 results yet, just looking at the pictures of his result from his quote-unquote 2020 film set model, which was previously Model 10. So film set, what does that stand for? It's flower imprint liquid migrating solid entrapping threads model. Should have stuck with toastograph. That was so much better. But yeah. Anyway, so it's I'm telling you right now, and I'll include the picture in the YouTube video, his most up-to-date images are not full length. There's gaps and discontinuities there. So yeah, utter failure. Even with Colin Berry's latest results, it doesn't do the trick here. Yeah, there's also issues. None of these techniques would inherently encode the vertically mapped wrapping distortions. Funny, that's something Colin Berry himself has never had on his checklist to reproduce that I saw anyways. And also with the hot statue method, you might ask, well, there's no body side images and that sort of thing, but heat, if you're using a 3D statue, then the sides of the body would radiate and that sort of thing. So why weren't they radiating and creating an image at all? So these are some of the generalized issues here with these minimal relevant feature 4. But let's get into a little bit specific details here. So looking at the hot bas-relief or scorching bas-relief method first, this method utterly fails to encode the vertically mapped wrapping distortions because given the flatness of the cloth during the time of encodation that caused the images, it wouldn't produce the subtle lateral distortions or vertical mapping feature. According to Shroud experts, look, to achieve, quote unquote, to achieve an image, the cloth must come into contact with the bas-relief. The Shroud wrapping distortions are subtle, and to achieve the same distortions with a bas-relief, a separate bas-relief would have to be used for the frontal image and a second bas-relief for the dorsal image. Dr. John Jackson noted that a shallow bas-relief would appear to just complicate reproducing the wrapping distortions found on the Shroud, where the wrapping distortions are consistent with an actual human body and a vertical projection of the body image onto the cloth. We hold that it is an inconsistency that a medieval artist would have anticipated this requirement and then been able to execute it with the realism observed on the Shroud of Turin with a contact-dependent method, such as a heated or scorched bas-relief, and or just with the use of a bas-relief in general. Ooh, that's devastating. Utter failure on this front for the scorched bas-relief method. With the hot statue method by people like Dr. Colin Berry, it's same problems. Absolute failure in terms of these techniques being able to account for the full-length continuous body images, as well as the vertically mapped wrapping distortions due to the isotropic heat radiating in all directions, including from the statue's sides. It's questionable whether it would be able to account for the no body side images, as we mentioned before. Although I'll give it to the Shroud skeptics. Let's pretend somehow the cloth was propped away from the sides or wasn't able to be encoded. I don't know how that would work, but the main thing is it's an utter failure. The hot statue methods do not account for the vertically mapped wrapping distortions in any way, and they can't even create full-length body images, as is evident from Colin Berry's most recent experiments in 2020. I'm looking at the picture itself. They're not complete. They're discontinuous. There are gaps in the image and that sort of thing. So yeah, this theory doesn't work. Okay, what about the engraved lines technique then? Right? Like the hot statue method and Colin Berry's method, he uses radiant heat, which travels out in all directions, so it wouldn't be just vertically as seen on the Shroud. The images wouldn't be vertically mapped. It's also improbable that an artist would be able to encode full-length continuous images, including the likely non-contact zones, using the engraved lines technique, because as Thibaut Heimberger says, quote unquote, scorching can be seen as an almost perfect contact-only image formation process. No contact, no color. And this method does envision certain areas would have to be not in contact in order to encode the three-dimensional aspects, even in theory. So yeah, this method can, however, theoretically account for the no body side images, as the engraved lines could simply have excluded anything like that, as well as the tops of the heads or something like that. So it would account for the no body side images. So that's it for minimal relevant feature number 4. What about with respect to minimal relevant feature number 5, about body image superficiality, no cementation or capillary flow, and body image non-saturation? You know, it's not as the color is not as dark as it could be. It's only about 23% plus or minus 5% saturated in terms of body image color or darkness. Well, obviously all of these techniques are able to easily satisfy the non-cementation or no capillary flow evidence. There's no viscous product that's deposited onto the shroud that would seep into it and that sort of thing. So obviously it fulfills those. All three of them fulfill this aspect. However, on the body image superficiality, this is where it's an utter failure. And it's been scientifically proven that all of these methods would fail on that front, because the images have repeatedly been scientifically demonstrated to produce consistently non-superficial images at the thread and fiber levels. So at the microscopic level, you never get it superficial. You might get a fabric level or macroscopic superficial image, but on the thread level, there's always more than just the top 2 to 3 fibrils that are colored. Not the fibril or fiber level, you don't just get the primary cell wall being colored. So microscopically, these always fail. In fact, STURP scientist Dr. John Jackson has scientifically proved that, quote unquote, heat will discolor through the thickness of the shroud in about 1/100th to 1/10th of a second. So you would have to have the cloth, have the bas-relief or statue or engraved metal plate on the cloth, and then take it away on a time scale like that in order to be consistent with what is observed on the Shroud of Turin. Now, it is important that Shroud skeptic Colin Berry begs to differ. He does claim to have accounted for the shroud's superficiality, although he denies the scientific fact that, which is a minimal relevant feature, that the shroud images are superficial on the fiber level. So he can't account for that, even with his 2020 method, I'm pretty sure. But again, I need to double check just to make sure. But he kind of begs to differ. And even the shroud skeptic Hugh Ferry kind of took him to task and said, no, it's a scientifically proven fact, proven beyond all reasonable doubt in the peer-reviewed literature. The color is only on the primary cell wall, so it's superficial at the fiber level. Now, Colin claims that it's also superficial on the thread level, only the top 2 to 3 fibrils. I'm skeptical of that, to be honest. I don't think that we've had proof. All the scientific tests that have been done by other scientists contradict that and say, nope, it's scientifically impossible for any kind of scorch to produce the superficiality at the thread level. It always scorches beyond that, unless you're capable of putting it for 1/100th to 1/10th of a second and then taking it off. That's impossible for human beings to do, especially in the medieval period. Why would a medieval artist even think to do that is beyond me. So yeah, and remember, with Colin Berry and his toastograph hypothesis, even he admits, at least as of the last time I referenced his work before the 2020, even he says, my images are superficial images, but then he qualifies it insofar as color is concentrated on crown, loop over, threads, though that is not exclusive to those locations. So it's not actually superficial at a microscopic level, and Berry himself is kind of admitting that, at least at this time. So mainstream scientists who aren't shroud skeptics, they basically say, quote unquote, so they admit, look, there is some measure of success in reproducing the shroud's superficiality, yes, yet it is not sufficient to demonstrate the ability to create microscopic coloring of individual linen fibers through heating that seems to match the shroud image's superficiality. To do that, one must produce an extensive frontal and dorsal image with consistent micro-superficiality. We as scientists are unaware of any success stories, even though numerous experiments have been attempted using heat and scorching. So, yeah, this is just devastating, and this is really the main Achilles heel of all scorching techniques. It doesn't matter. I guarantee you, when I look at Berry's 2020 thing, he's going to fail the shrouds to imitate or reproduce the shroud's superficiality. I'm very confident. Again, I shouldn't say that until I check it out, because maybe some miracle happened, but I'm pretty confident that he's not going to be able to do it, because it's an inherent problem of any and all scorching techniques. It doesn't matter what he did. It's always going to be a problem. Furthermore, pro shroud expert Thibaut Heimberger also has, through his own scientific experiments, discovered that, quote-unquote, a scorch in the real world simply cannot be as superficial as desired. Even the faintest scorch, superficial at the fabric level, is simply not superficial at the thread level, and by extension at the fiber level, or the level of the fibril. It's not just on that primary cell wall. Continuing to quote, "This is easily explained by the high-resolution microscopy of lightly scorched fibers. The reason for this becomes apparent using high-resolution microscopy. Quote unquote, at the lowest temperature able to give a discoloration of the linen, heat is mainly and immediately conducted by the web of pectin, a kind of glue, forming the remnants of the middle lamella, which are found at the surface and in between all the fibers. So, that would be the ultimate cells, so to speak. As a result, Heimberger concludes, quote unquote, a scorched image is not superficial. It can be superficial at fabric levels, but not at a thread or fiber level. It doesn't appear possible to achieve the superficiality seen on the Shroud of Turin with even a relatively small area like the face using the lightest of scorch techniques, let alone for the whole shroud's frontal and dorsal images to be produced with the 3 levels of superficiality as seen on the shroud. Incredible. This just destroys any and all heat-based or scorch-based methods. All right, let's move on. Minimal relevant feature number 6. These are the anatomical accuracies, and as well features related to the bloodstains on the Shroud of Turin. How do these mechanisms perform on that front? So as we kind of saw with all the other ordinary artistic mechanisms, it would be impossible for a medieval artist, given what we historically know about their ignorance and foolishness about the human body and anatomy, impossible for them to create images that would be able to fool 24 forensic and medical world's experts, dating from the early 20th century, of atheists, skeptics, Jewish, Christians. They all agree this is anatomically correct. We've even had an anatomical anthropometric analysis done by scientific instruments and computers that have proven mathematically that this is an anatomically correct body. Incredible. Impossible. A medieval artist couldn't make a statue like that, couldn't make a bas-relief like that, couldn't engrave lines like that. So these techniques just utterly fail to account for the anatomical accuracies. As well, with the bloodstains, why would you make invisible serum retraction rings or invisible scratches? So if you want to say you painted with blood and that sort of thing, maybe that explains the serum retraction rings that are invisible. They didn't even know. Nonetheless, why would you create invisible scratches and wounds that nobody would see until the invention of ultraviolet fluorescence lighting in the 20th century? No, it's ridiculous if you believe a medieval artist was capable of making the Shroud's anatomical accuracies. Utter failure for every method here. Just impossible to be true, scientifically and historically speaking. Okay, what about specifically the bloodstain images then? So this, as we said, all heating and scorching methods don't even attempt to account for the bloodstain images in their scientific experiments. They just try to reproduce a face or the body images or something like that. But nonetheless, there's absolute failure here. So see the painting hypothesis, because if it's an artistic theory, then they would have had to paint the bloodstain images. So go back to my episode with Dr. Walter McCroney, Shroud Solo Show parts 7 and 8, where I discuss issues with the painting hypothesis. Also, if you're going to possibly the actual body was used or something, that wouldn't work with scorching. But I'm going to address direct contact problems with those methods for encoding bloodstains in a future show. I'm just going to bypass that, but there are a couple things specific to the Scorch hypothesis that provide additional problems with respect to the blood stain. So in the first place, there's no body images underneath the blood stain. So if we posit that the blood stains were painted on first or put on the shroud first through direct contact or something, maybe he found a bloody corpse, put a shroud over it, and then he scorched it with the sculpture or something like that, well, that would inevitably burn and alter and damage the blood stains. But that's not what we have with the Shroud of Turin. That's scientifically impossible to have happened. Okay, so maybe he scorched the body images and then painted the bloodstains on top of it. But again, that's scientifically impossible, because then the scorch images would be underneath the shroud. There would be body images under the bloodstains on the shroud, but that's not what we have. Scientifically impossible for these mechanisms to explain this image feature, that there's no body images underneath the bloodstains at all, whatever way you put it. So in the words of the credible STURP scientists, quote unquote, the blood was deposited on the cloth first, but related to there being no image under the blood, there is the observation that there's no damage to the blood or serum retraction rings. So this creates a major inconsistency for the hot bas-relief, hot statue, and engraving methods. In these methods, heat is used. Blood is more thermally unstable than linen. So this means the blood images would have been in direct contact with the heated bas-relief or statue or whatever it is, and would thus be obliterated or show major evidence of charring. But microscopic observations of the shroud's blood areas do not show any degradation at all due to heat, except at the intersection of the bloodstains with the fire damage from the 1532 fire that we know about. These are utter failures as methods. Okay, let's get into the minimal relevant feature number 7, the last one, and these are the additional properties discovered on the shroud. How do these image-forming mechanisms, these heat-based models, do in terms of that? Okay, so the first additional minimal relevant feature under MRF 7 category is additional feature number 2. And this says, well, look, the non-image areas of the Shroud of Turin fluoresce, but the body images do not fluoresce in the visible under ultraviolet illumination, or UV illumination. Furthermore, there's no fluorescent pyrolysis products found in the image areas of the Shroud of Turin's body images. And that supports the conclusion that the shroud images formed at a relatively low temperature within the quote-unquote non-thermal range. That's technical jargon. So yeah, this is a minimal relevant feature. It's a scientifically proven fact published in the peer-reviewed journals. Nobody can deny it. And all shroud experts agree that the chemistry of the colored microlayer on the shroud's image fibers do, at face value, seem to resemble the chemistry of a scorched image. And if this is the case, well, then we would expect it to fluoresce like scorched images under UV illumination, but yet they don't. Interesting. So, yeah, this is the first major issue to arise. STURP actually tested specifically for this and scientifically proved that the shroud images, body images, do not fluoresce red under ultraviolet illumination, as would be expected if they were formed from a scorch or a heat-based method. And like I said, this is observed. For example, there was scorching that took place in 1532. There was a major fire, and one part of the shroud was slightly affected. We have burn marks on the shroud, and there was a blood stain near there, and they were scorched. And that does fluoresce. The fire burn marks do fluoresce under ultraviolet illumination as expected. So for this reason alone, many shroud scientists and experts have dismissed out of hand any possibility for the image-forming mechanism involving a scorch or a heat-based method, such as the 3 ones we're looking at here. So, for example, pro-shroud expert Barry Schwartz says, quote-unquote, scorched linen will fluoresce red under ultraviolet excitation. So we photographed the entire shroud using ultraviolet fluorescence photography, and sure enough, every known scorch fluoresced in the red, just as we expected. But the image itself did not fluoresce. In fact, it even quenched the pale yellow-green background fluorescence of the cloth itself. thus proving that the Shroud image is not the product of a high temperature event, scorching event. In other words, we prove that the image is not a scorch. Now, there is a qualification here in Berry's quote. So notice that Berry's saying it fluoresces red, and that indicates a high temperature scorch. So Shroud skeptics, they don't use a high temperature, they use low temperatures, 200 degrees Celsius or lower or something like that, to produce light scorches. And well, that would bypass Berry's issue here, right? We wouldn't expect a low temperature scorch within the non-thermal range to fluoresce red in this way. Well, even other Shroud experts like Thibaut Heimberger, for example, would agree, look, quote unquote, we demonstrated in one scientific experiment that the material of the plumes could be transported by water, but the underlying scorched cellulose retained a bright yellow-green fluorescence, even when it's a light scorch. So this demonstration, together with the observed absence of body image fluorescence, is strong evidence against the cause for the body images being a scorch. So there is a lot of pro-Shroud experts do seem to think that in all probability, the Shroud, even if it's a light scorch at a low temperature, relatively low. I mean, 200 degrees Celsius isn't really low. That would burn, the boiling point's 100 degrees Celsius. But, it's relatively low compared to a thermal, scorches within the thermal range, which is really high. And they say, no, we would expect there to be at least some sort of fluorescence, yellow-green to red, under ultraviolet illumination. Now, the Shroud skeptic Colin Berry completely denies this, and he says, look, he addresses this issue head-on in his own experiments and writings, and he claims, look, he's demonstrated, according to him, that it is possible for a light scorch method to produce images that do not fluoresce under ultraviolet illumination in exactly the same way the Shroud's body images don't. And I'm going to include a link to that blog so you can read it with your own eyeballs there. And also there, again, principle of enemy attestation. There are even some pro-Shroud proponents like Dr. John Jackson and the Turin Shroud Center who tentatively agree with Colin Berry, the Shroud skeptic, and they say, look, quote unquote, the Shroud image did not fluoresce brightly when illuminated with ultraviolet light. A scorch typically does fluoresce brightly. This indicates that there is a subtle difference in chemistry between the Shroud and Scorch produced images. Nevertheless, the chemistry is close, and we do not currently think a difference in fluorescence, as understood today, can be used to absolutely rule out some kind of Scorch type mechanism. And these are pro-Shroud experts, Dr. John Jackson, the leader of STIRP, and his team and that sort of thing. So I think it's important to note that there are some differences of opinion here. Definitely scorches typically produce fluorescence images that fluoresce in ultraviolet light from yellow-green to red, depending on the temperature at stake here. But there are some other experts who disagree, and Colin Berry claims to have provided scientific experiments proving that it's possible to lightly scorch the Shroud and not produce ultraviolet images. Obviously that's not in peer review, so whether you trust him, you have to take it on faith that he's being credible in the blogs, and obviously, like I said, some pro-Shroud experts do seem to back him up that the lack of fluorescence versus having fluorescence isn't enough to conclusively rule one way or the other. So on that basis, I'm assigning again a questionable status. We have to respect that Shroud experts like Thibaut Heimberger, Barry Schwartz, and Mark Antonacci all stick to their guns and say, no, in all probability, on a balance of probabilities, we would expect the images to fluoresce if they were produced through a scorching technique, especially in the medieval period. To pretend that they had the ability to, Colin Berry, for example, he knows he's got to produce this result, so he's using 21st century scientific knowledge to make the scorch in such a way that the images don't fluoresce. That's highly unlikely to be the case with a medieval person, a medieval artist or something like that. He wouldn't be trying to get this result. He wouldn't have a clue what ultraviolet illumination is. And therefore, I think you could say historically, you could make the argument that we would probably expect some kind of fluorescence to take place, even if it was just a light scorch or something like that. It wouldn't be perfect like what we have with the Shroud of Turin. So that would be the argument there. I've assigned questionable because I always assume in favor of the Shroud skeptic whenever there's a dispute among Shroud experts and there's some questionable elements. But nonetheless, I think you, as the person who's interested in actual truth, can ask yourself, well, is it really the case that we would expect a medieval artist to produce scorched images that are so light that they don't fluoresce at all? Were they even capable of doing that with the technology at the time? So yeah, that's it for that one. Let's move on to the next additional feature here. And this is the simple fact of the color of the Shroud images. The body images are yellow to light brown fibers made up of degraded or oxidized cellulose. And it's been scientifically proven through experiments, dozens of experiments conducted by both Shroud skeptics and pro-Shroud scientists, that it's quote-unquote simply impossible to obtain an image made only of pale yellow to light brown fibers. Thibaut Heimberger summarizes his findings by saying that light scorches and scorch marks produce an inevitable spectrum of results, which include light brown to black colored fibrils. And I'll include pictures from his articles on this. While a very faint or light scorch does reproduce the pale yellow color of the Shroud, it will not, however, produce continuous coloring, as very few of the threads making up the body images were colored in his experimental results, reproducing some of what the Shroud skeptics are doing. And this is in direct contrast to the Shroud, where all the threads are colored. And again, you can see this even in the 2020 results with Dr. Colin Berry. That picture, he doesn't get full-length body images, continuous images. There's not continuous coloring using his very faint or very light scorch technique. So this is just an utter failure on this part for all these types of methods. Now, to be fair to the Shroud skeptics, for example, Dr. Colin Berry, he's obviously aware of this basic scientific fact. He wouldn't dare deny the obvious truth on this front because he's an actual scientist and he knows the facts. So he basically says, well, maybe most of the heated fibers, being more fragile, were eliminated by aging and handling of the Turin Shroud over the centuries. And this hypothesis might explain why there's this monochromatic yellow color of the body image fibers. We don't have these dark brown or black burnt fibers on the Shroud left over. They all fell off and were abraded over time. And perhaps the half-tone effect, the over-scorched individual fibers or bundles of fibers on the image would have been eliminated through abrasion over the centuries. And remember, Colin Berry, in the list of things, he included the half-tone effect as on his checklist of something he's been able to duplicate. Again, not submitted to peer review. This is just his claim on his blog, on his Model 10 and revised Model 10 methods. I'm assuming it's the same for his newest 2020 model as well. But let's take a step back here. So the skeptic is admitting the facts, saying that scorches always produce this spectrum. Thibaut Heimberger, absolutely scientifically proven fact, is right. And that is not present on the Shroud. We just have these yellow to light brown body image color fibers. So that falsifies the scorch hypothesis right there. But what if over the centuries through abrasion, all of the darker colored ones, because they were more brittle, they were burnt worse or scorched worse, so they were more brittle and fragile, they abraded off, leaving behind the yellow-colored ones that we have today. Well, pro-Shroud experts Thibaut Heimberger are aware of this comeback, and they've scientifically falsified this kind of response. There's no evidence for abrasion happening at all during the examination of actual scorched areas. Remember that 1532 fire? We have real dark brown to black scorched things on the Shroud that are 500 years old, between 400 and 500 years old. And there's zero evidence for any kind of abrasion after all that time, after all the handling in those areas. In fact, there's no sign of any so-called abrasion effects postulated by the Shroud skeptics for these locations, and these still give the reddish brown coloring just as expected from a full-on Scorch event. So that's interesting. Why, if abrasion is truly happening, why wouldn't it happen to these Scorch things that happened 400 to 500 years ago? They would have to be gone, and yet they're not. So this scientifically falsifies this excuse or explanation as to why Colin Berry or all heat-based Scorch techniques don't match the color of the Shroud of Turin in terms of those yellow fiber, monochromatic yellow colors. So Heimberger, he concludes and he says this, look, quote unquote, time, aging, and handling of the Turin Shroud do not explain the monochromatic yellow color of the Turin Shroud image, and they do not explain the halftone effect, particularly the observed fact that uncolored bundles of fibers are found adjacent to colored layers of fibers on the Turin Shroud image at the thread level. When a hot template is put in contact with a linen fabric, and by hot template, that could be either the bas-relief, the statue, or an engraved metal sheet, to cover all three of our methods under this umbrella category. When that is put in contact with a linen fabric, the pectin glue or middle lamella that is found elsewhere at the surface and between the fibers is immediately colored, and this is the main source of the color in a light scorch. This fact would have been obviously discovered by the Stirp scientific team in 1978, and particularly by the world-famous scientist Dr. Ray Rogers in his examinations. Nonetheless, the Turin Shroud image was not discovered to be a scorch. It is not a scorch. Bada boom, bada bing. I'm sorry. All the Shroud skeptics, even Colin Berry's 2020 results from what I've seen of the pictures on his website so far, again, I haven't researched it thoroughly, but I've taken a quick scan, and even his results as of 2020 fail in this respect. They cannot be true as to the explanation of the formation of the Shroud of Turin's images. All right, great. So that does it in terms of the evaluation, in terms of the various 7 minimal relevant feature categories. What do we make in terms of our cumulative case conclusions and considerations? Well, starting off with the plausibility criterion, in the first place, it has the Shroud is totally unique, despite there being dozens and dozens of scientific experiments by both Shroud skeptics and pro-Shroud experts to try and duplicate the entirety of the Shroud's physical and chemical characteristics through some kind of a scorch technique. So therefore it's unique, despite sufficient or ample opportunity for such images to have been duplicated within a naturalistic context, i.e. artificially in the lab. It's had an artificial opportunity. Secondly, on a theoretical level, it's implausible as well, because the scorching methods are implausible because we know that radiating heat is isotropic. It would be expected to diffuse in all directions and thereby create blurry images. So our background knowledge of how heat radiates out in an isotropic manner mitigates against these mechanisms creating the strictly vertically mapped, rectilinear or curvilinear, vertically mapped wrapping distortions on the Shroud of Turin. So yeah, our background knowledge makes this type of mechanism very unlikely. Thirdly, scorch methods are also likely to scorch through the linen in a fraction of a second, 1/100th to 1/10th of a second. It is simply inconceivable that a human artist either in the modern period or in the medieval period would be able to control the scorching mechanism in such a way as to not violate the body image superficiality at all 3 of the levels. And again, our background knowledge, even Colin Berry and Shroud skeptics' scientific experiments, cannot reproduce the Shroud body image's superficiality at all 3 levels. And There's also that issue where even if we do produce superficiality on some scale, at the fabric level perhaps, we have to sacrifice on the three-dimensional information. So that's another implausibility. There's that trade-off. You either have to choose, do you want to encode some 3D information? Again, some, not fully like the Shroud of Turin. And or do you want to encode body image superficiality? You can't have both, like with the Shroud of Turin. And finally, there's also an inconsistency that a medieval artist would have anticipated this requirement and been able to execute it with the realism observed on the Shroud of Turin, using any kind of contact-dependent method, such as all these heat or scorch techniques require. Remember, it's either encoded or it's not. If whatever is touching the hot template, statue, bas-relief, or plate gets encoded. If you're not touching, heat does not radiate through air, so no images are encoded in those areas. So for that reason, this is highly implausible. Okay, so in terms of explanatory scope, these types of mechanisms, scorch mechanisms, typically don't even try to account for the bloodstain images at all. And thus they require a kind of combo theory, so either the bloodstains were painted before or after the body images were scorched, and or there is a use of a direct contact method through a bloody body. They encode the blood on the shroud from the bloody body before or after the scorched images. And again, we saw none of those work, so it fails to account on that front. What's worse, though, again, as I said, the heat-based models of these scorch techniques are inconsistent with the encoding of the bloodstain images, no matter what way you envision the bloodstains being put onto the shroud. So there's an inherent inconsistency. They can't go together. You can't make a combination method, and therefore it lacks explanatory scope. Now, and also there's that thing that I just mentioned under plausibility. Remember, you can't get both the shroud's 3 levels of superficiality and all of the tridimensional, tridimensional or three-dimensional topographical information as encoded on the Shroud of Turin. There's this trade-off. You have to choose. You either have better 3D info. Again, it's not going to be like the Shrouds, but you can get better or worse kind of thing, or you get superficiality. So you have to make that trade-off. That means you lack explanatory scope. These mechanisms mean that to get one feature, you have to sacrifice on the other, and you have to make that choice. So on that front, it lacks explanatory scope. In the words of Shroud expert Thibaut Heimberger, quote-unquote, "It seems impossible using a Scorch template to have an image that is at the same time, one, superficial at the fabric level, threads level, and fibril level, and two, contrasted but not over-scorched, and three, with three-dimensional properties." So all three of those properties are contradictory to each other, and therefore it fails to have explanatory scope. Okay, what about explanatory power? They all fail to explain several of the minimal relevant features, such as the body image superficiality at the microscopic levels, the body image uniformity of color. Such theories appear very forced in that respect in terms of accounting for the body image uniformity of intensity of color. There are some issues for some of the mechanisms with the maximum densities being the exact uniform between the frontal and dorsal images. And such methods just inherently can't and don't even attempt to explain the vertically mapped wrapping distortion. So as far as I can tell, these methods all lack explanatory power in that way. So, all right, moving on to the next criterion, less ad hoc, or the Criterion of Simplicity. How does it do here? Well, from what I can see, there's only really one major glaringly ad hoc component to all these types of Scorch methods, and that's the fact that based on the color, the shroud images are monochromatic, yellow and or light brown in color. They're all that same one color. There's no dark brown or black burn fibrils that are inevitable on any and all Scorch method techniques. And the only way to avoid that is for the shroud skeptic to say, well, maybe through abrasion over the centuries, they all just happened to vanish, and we lost every single one of them, so that's why there was 0 of them discovered on the shroud during the scientific study in 1978. But this is extremely ad hoc. fact that the scorch marks from the 1532 fire still maintain the dark brown to black burn fibrils. For the past 400 to 500 years, they weren't lost through abrasion and that sort of thing. In fact, there are no signs of any abrasion at all, scientifically speaking, on those 1532 burn marks from the fire back in 1532. So that's extremely ad hoc to be like, well, everything from when it was formed were abraded. All those things from 1350 were abraded when the medieval artists first scorched the image. But the ones from a couple hundred years later, the 1532 fire, those scorched things that were left intact, abrasion didn't affect them. That's extremely ad hoc, and therefore these mechanisms fail on that basis. So yeah, that does it. In terms of our analysis, I think in closing, all heat-based or scorch-type techniques, artistic hypotheses, are very improbable explanations for the image formation of the Shroud's minimal relevant features. Obviously, I do need to do that updated show on Colin Berry, just to be fair to him and give him in his best light. I need to do that show, addendum show, giving the update on Colin Berry's 2020 techniques. Again, I think that we're going to be seeing a lot of the same failures mentioned in this show are going to apply to that show, but let's give him a fair chance. I haven't researched it, so I don't want to say with certainty. Let's wait and see. Same with Hugh Ferry's method. I haven't even touched on his, so I'm going to address his technique in that. Even Colin Berry's 2020 technique fail to account for all of the Shroud's minimal relevant features. And as just to close off, I'll quote once again to Bo Heimberger, that great Shroud expert that I've been using as one of my primary sources in this. He gives up his final, yet particularly apt conclusion about heat-based or scorch techniques, and he says, look, quote-unquote, the Turin Shroud image is not a scorch, not even a light scorch. In fact, this old hypothesis is very easy to rule out, definitively as the Shroud's body image formation mechanism, with some basic scientific experiments and a microscope. So that's pretty devastating, that's pretty telling. So yeah, with that, I'll leave it on that front, and yeah, I think I will say thank you very much for listening. I hope that you guys found this entertaining. I know that the Shroud solo series are interesting and important for a lot of you guys, so I really appreciate you guys listening to the show on that front. I'm going to take a bit of a hiatus from the solo shows for the time being, for a couple months, at least until I can figure out my fall work schedule. I have to write my thesis paper. I'm taking courses again. And I'm teaching critical thinking, philosophy of critical thinking to the first year university students again. So give me some time. I'm going to take a bit of a break and try to figure things out schedule-wise. But as soon as I can, I'm going to continue on with this Shroud series. Next type of mechanism, not ordinary artistic mechanisms. We just finished those, and we covered all of them. Now we're going to cover the ordinary naturalistic mechanisms, so things like direct contact, things like gas diffusion models and that sort of thing. So these are models that necessarily involve a dead human corpse or a human body being used without any and natural mechanisms, without the input of any artistic creativity or artistic intent or inputs or anything like that. So that we're onto a new major category of theories here. So yeah, with that said, I think I'm happy that we finished off the ordinary artistic techniques and all the various things. I hope that you can see that, yeah, now you can understand why the credible STURP scientists and pro-Shroud experts say it's ridiculous to believe that any kind of artistic method in the medieval period was capable of reproducing all of the Shroud's minimal relevant features and those physical and chemical characteristics. They just don't work, and they can't even work theoretically. There is nothing else that Shroud skeptics can postulate to explain this. They all just have to come up with certain variations on these main categories of artistic mechanisms that we've already covered and refuted and shown that even on a theoretical level, any tweaking you do doesn't seem to be able to work. Again, that's tentative based on Colin Berry's 2020 update and my assessment of Hugh Ferry's mechanism, which I just haven't addressed at all. But I think we'll come to the same conclusion. You'll see that those mechanisms for one reason or another, don't work in explaining or accounting for all of the Shroud's minimal relevant features either. So, yeah, with that said, that'll be it. I'll let you guys enjoy the show. Now, in the meantime, just because I'm taking a break from my Shroud solo show for a couple of months or something, or a few months until I get settled in, I still plan to have debates or discussion shows on the Shroud. So a couple Shroud Wars debates and discussions that I want to bring on with Hugh Ferry. So that's dependent on my being able to get the guests to come on. But yeah, you can at least look forward to some Shroud Wars debates while you're waiting for me to continue my Shroud solo shows. So that said, have a great week and take care, everyone. All right, bye-bye.